conservatism, which often is thought of as a kind of liberalism at the speed limit, should also, as understood in that sense, should also be done away with. What we would need to recover is something like...
Conservatism isn't liberalism in slow motion.
Well, I've got the bust of Roger Scruton up there. He once said in his last book, conservatism, and he's, one of the godfather of conservative philosophy, at least here in the UK, he once said that conservatism is a hesitation within liberalism. That's a fairly standard view among many, many conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think you and I probably would push beyond that. We'd say, no, actually, the seeds of its own demise were in liberalism's origins. And if that's true, isn't conservatism, or whatever name we want to give it, a recovery of something more ancient that is upstream of that, whether it's nourished by the biblical stories, whether it's nourished by Greece and Rome, whether it's nourished by the scholastics and the Renaissance? Do you think the task is recovering something that's upstream of the Enlightenment, and what would that be?
Well, yes, I definitely think that. I think that we've outlined that to some degree already. I would say that conservatives stand for the primacy of the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice, right? That's the bedrock of civilization. Now, then that's
gratitude, acceptance of limits as they're given to us,
adoption of responsibility,
that we discover the world, we organize our perceptions of it, but we don't construct it. We don't just make up whatever narrative we want as we go along. This is your diagnosis.
Well, we certainly don't.
Post-structuralism.
We don't make up the narrative if the fundamental narrative is one of voluntary self-sacrifice.
Absolutely. I think this is the key to what you saw before most of us, namely that the antidote to post-structuralism can't just be another story. It must be a story that claims to be disclosive of truth. That is to say...
the nature of reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you would say that that's why you're drawn back to the Bible rather than to say,
yes,
Abraham, it's a story of adventure, but so's the Odyssey. In many ways, it's a more interesting and more invigorating adventure. But you think, no, it's these texts, the texts that Jews and Christians recognize as revelation, that are uniquely disclosive of the way reality is, and that's what needs to be conserved against liberalism.
Here's an interesting fact. Every single Catholic and Protestant majority country outside of Africa is a fully functioning Western democracy of the sort that the dispossessed flee to of their own free will. 100%. 47 of 50 Islamic majority countries are totalitarian. Let's leave it at that. Are totalitarian. Okay. It doesn't take much perspicacity to infer that there might be a causal link. Now, the question is, what's the link? Well, if the idea that voluntary self-sacrifice is the proper foundation of civilized society and an integrated psyche, because those two things go together, then the Judeo-Christian meta-narrative is correct. Now, what that means metaphysically, I don't know what it means metaphysically. Not exactly. I mean, you have the idea that the ultimate sacrifice of Christ is the principle upon which the world was founded at the beginning of time.
It's very different from, you used the compound Judeo-Christian there, and I think it's a convenient label. But I get a little bit uneasy about it because, we've already in our conversation so far drawn quite a sharp distinction between the understanding of sacrifice in, in the Old Testament and the closural perspective on sacrifice in the New Testament, the idea that the sacrifice on Golgotha is the last sacrifice. It brings the whole...
it's the eternal sacrifice.
Right, and so I'm thinking... And I actually looked at this the other day, I did an Google engram of it. Judeo-Christian as a term does not really emerge until after the Second World War. But that's when it suddenly goes up. And I'm wondering, is it helpful? Should we be thinking of Judaism and Christianity? Yes, of course, as closely connected, but as distinct traditions with distinct narratives, which are pushing towards, in the end, quite different conceptions of
Well, there's definitely
reality
a different
and
conception of the primacy of Christ's sacrifice.
Sure.
Obviously, that's a dividing line.
Yeah.
No, I've been informed in my thinking tremendously by the Old Testament stories and have an immense amount of respect for the Jewish intellectual and literary tradition. And I think that the notion that the sacrificial pattern in the Old Testament culminates in the New Testament, it makes perfect narrative sense. And I understand what it means, and it seems to me to be right. Now, right, why? Well, there's a technical reason in a way. I mean, one of Jung's claims, for example, was that the Christian passion was an archetypal redemptive tragedy. And by archetypal, he meant that it specified the central pattern with unerring accuracy, and so couldn't be superseded. Now,
an archetype that couldn't actually have a type.
It couldn't be superseded, like, because so a way of thinking about
it could be imitated maybe, but it wouldn't have the certainly in context of Christian theology, it wouldn't have the salvific effects that are attributed.
Well, it
to
is imitated.
sacrifice.
I mean, the martyr.
Or the redemption of humanity. No one other than Christ can or needs to achieve.
Right. Well, that's all.
the
That's
redemption
almost
of humanity.
and that's the hypothesis. And the idea. I mean, the psychological idea is something like this: that tragedy, redemptive tragedy, but let's just go with tragedy to begin with, has a form. Now we know that because we wouldn't be able to have the category of tragedy if tragedy didn't have a form. Now you could imagine 1,000 tragedies. Now you could imagine extracting the essential features of those tragedies. A large language model could probably do that, by the way. Anyways, then you could imagine constructing a single tragedy that exemplified the core elements of the common features of tragedy. And I think that's exactly what the Passion story does.
Do you think, I mean, there's a big debate about this among theologians, particularly in Cambridge, as to whether tragedy is the right prism to understand what happens on Golgotha. I mean,
well, it doesn't specify the resurrection.
No, that's right. And
that's a problem.
That's a problem, exactly. So the question is, the denouement, as it were, the resurrection, as it were, it doesn't permit us to think of that sort of radical sense of loss and incommensurability that you see is very much the mark of the tragic.
Well, it's actually a comedy, technically speaking, right? Because it has a happy ending, right? But the bulk of the drama is the tragedy and the encounter with the depths of suffering. And you could think about the Passion story as a thorough explanation of the dimensions of suffering, right? Because the death occurs to someone who's young. It's the most shameful possible death. It was designed to be the most painful possible death. It's imposed by a tyrant. It's brought about by betrayal. Like, you can just stack. All you have to do is make a list of all the terrible things that could happen to you that you would think were terrible, expand them so they're the worst of their form, and then aggregate them. And that's what you have in the Passion story. And so that's in a way that's why it's a limit case. You could tell another terrible story, but if you told a story that was just as terrible, it would look very much like that story.
And it's a story that gives one hope. Would you say that it's a story that gives you hope to a degree that no other story can? I mean, that was the sense, I think, around the table for all of us, even those of us who would not consider ourselves church-going Christians. I mean, we like to talk on this podcast about what dawn might look like.
Well, even practically speaking, I mean, the Christians defeated Rome. Well,
from the catacombs.
Exactly. And so
peacefully,
merely from a secular perspective. Well,
yeah.
And that means they also established civilization on a basis other than that of, let's call it, nobility and power.